the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would reshape the very fabric of medieval Europe, did not ignite in a sudden dramatic burst, but rather smoldered for generations, fueled by tangled dynastic claims and the simmering resentments of feudal power. Long before the first arrow flew at Crécy, or the Maid of Orléans heard her celestial voices, the seeds of this epic struggle were sown in the intricate tapestry of royal marriages and territorial ambitions that defined the High Middle Ages. Imagine, if you will, the early 14th century, a time when the borders of nations were less like solid lines on a modern map and more like shifting sands, constantly sculpted by inheritance, conquest, and alliance. At the heart of this brewing storm lay a profound genealogical dilemma, a question of bloodline and legitimacy that would plunge two great kingdoms into a century of intermittent, brutal warfare. The story truly begins with the Capetian dynasty, the long-reigning kings of France, whose unbroken male line had stretched for over 3 centuries, a remarkable feat in an era often marked by fragile successions. From Hugh Capet in the late 10th century, through generations of Louis and Philip, the Capetians had steadily consolidated their power, transforming a patchwork of feudal lordships into something resembling a unified kingdom. Their legacy was one of stability and gradual expansion, a steady hand guiding the destiny of France. However, in the early 14th century, this unbroken chain began to fray. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair for his handsome appearance, but perhaps more aptly for his ruthless pragmatism, had 3 sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. One by one, these sons ascended to the French throne, and one by one, they died without leaving a surviving male heir. This was an unprecedented crisis. The Salic law, an ancient Frankish custom, though not formally codified as a bar to female succession in France until this very period, was increasingly invoked by French jurists and nobles to prevent the crown from passing through a woman. It was a convenient legal argument, perhaps, but one that held immense weight in a patriarchal society. When Charles IV, the last of Philip IV's sons, died in 1328, the Capetian direct male line, which had seemed so invincible, extinguished itself. The immediate question became, who would wear the crown of France? The most direct claimant, by primogeniture, was not a Frenchman at all, but an Englishman, King Edward III of England. Edward was the son of Isabella, the daughter of Philip IV, and thus, by blood, the closest surviving relative to the deceased Charles IV. His claim was simple. If a woman could not inherit the throne, could she not at least transmit the right of inheritance to her son? This was the crux of the Plantagenet claim to the French throne, a claim that would echo through generations of conflict. The French nobility, however, had little appetite for an English king. They feared losing their autonomy, their cultural identity, and their influence to a foreign monarch. Their preferred candidate was Philip, Count of Valois, a nephew of Philip IV, and thus a cousin to the last 3 Capetian kings. His claim rested on the principle that the French crown could only pass through the male line, and that Isabella, as a woman, could not transmit a right she herself did not possess. This interpretation of Salic law, though flexible in its application in other European monarchies, became the cornerstone of French succession. Philip of Valois was crowned King Philip VI of France, establishing the House of Valois as the new ruling dynasty. Initially, Edward III, preoccupied with domestic issues and a nascent war with Scotland, grudgingly accepted Philip VI's ascension. In 1329, he even paid homage to Philip for his continental possessions, primarily the Duchy of Aquitaine, also known as Gascony. a large and valuable territory in southwestern France that had been an English possession for centuries. This act of homage, however, was a constant source of friction. The English kings, as Dukes of Aquitaine, were vassals to the French crown, yet as kings of England, they considered themselves sovereign rulers. This feudal paradox created an inherent tension, a perpetual low hum of discontent that underscored every Anglo-French interaction. The Duchy of Aquitaine was not merely a patch of land, it was a vital economic asset, producing wine, salt, and other valuable commodities that enriched the English treasury. It also provided a strategic foothold on the continent, a base from which English power could project itself into French affairs. For the French kings, the presence of such a large, powerful English enclave within their borders was an affront to their sovereignty and a constant threat to their territorial integrity. It was a thorn in their side, a reminder of past feudal arrangements that they desperately wished to dismantle. Beyond the grand dynastic claims and the contentious issue of Aquitaine, other, more localized conflicts further stirred the pot. The County of Flanders, a wealthy region known for its thriving wool and textile industry, was another point of contention. While technically a French fief, Flanders had strong economic ties to England, which supplied the raw wool essential for its looms. The Flemish towns, fiercely independent and often rebellious against their French overlords, frequently looked to England for support. This created a complex web of allegiances, where economic necessity often trumped feudal loyalty, and where both England and France sought to exert influence. Another flashpoint was the Anglo-Scottish alliance. France, ever keen to destabilize its rival, actively supported Scotland in its ongoing wars for independence against England. This Auld Alliance, as it came to be known, provided a strategic distraction for England, forcing it to divide its resources and attention. Edward III, a proud and ambitious monarch, deeply resented this French interference in what he considered his rightful domain. He saw it as a direct challenge to his authority and a deliberate attempt to undermine his kingdom. The years leading up to 1337, the traditional start date of the 100 Years' War, were thus marked by a series of escalating provocations and diplomatic failures. Edward III, increasingly confident after his successes against Scotland, and perhaps emboldened by the perceived weakness of the new Valois king, began to reassert his claim to the French throne with greater vigor. He felt his honor was at stake, his rightful inheritance denied. The French, for their part, saw Edward's actions as a dangerous encroachment on their sovereignty, a direct challenge to their newly established dynasty. The immediate spark for the declaration of war came in 1337. Philip VI, citing Edward's continued support for Robert III of Artois, a French noble who had been condemned for treason, and Edward's refusal to perform full homage for Aquitaine, declared the confiscation of the Duchy of Aquitaine. This was the ultimate insult, a direct challenge to English power, and a blatant attempt to strip Edward of his most valuable continental possession. For Edward III, this act was the final straw. It provided the perfect casus belli, the legitimate cause for war that he had perhaps been seeking. On October 7, 1337, Edward III formally rejected Philip VI's claim to the French throne and asserted his own. He declared himself the rightful king of France, thereby transforming a simmering feudal dispute into a full-blown dynastic war. The stage was set for a conflict of unprecedented scale and duration, a war that would fundamentally alter the course of English and French history. It was a war born not just of a single grievance, but of generations of intertwined destinies, conflicting claims, and the relentless pursuit of power and prestige. The echoes of these dynastic disputes and feudal tensions would resonate for over a century, shaping battles, forging heroes, and leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of Europe. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke still clung to the air as the new decade dawned, marking the year 1340. Edward III, now a king in his own right, his youthful impetuousness tempered by the weight of his ambition, stood poised on the brink of a conflict that would redefine the very nature of warfare. His claim to the French throne, once a whispered aspiration, had hardened into a declared right, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would ripple through generations. The early skirmishes, often naval, had already hinted at the ferocity to come. The Battle of Sluys in 1340, a brutal engagement fought in the narrow confines of the Zwin estuary, saw English archers unleash their deadly volleys upon the tightly packed decks of the French fleet, transforming the sea into a chaotic tapestry of splintered wood and desperate cries. It was a decisive English victory, crippling French naval power and securing control of the Channel, a vital artery for future campaigns. This early triumph, though bloody, cemented Edward's resolve and perhaps, in the quiet moments of reflection, whispered promises of greater glories. The war, however, was not merely a clash of armies, but also a contest of wills and resources. France, with its larger population and vast agricultural lands, seemed to possess an inexhaustible wellspring of manpower and wealth. Yet its feudal structure, with powerful dukes and counts often pursuing their own agendas, sometimes hampered a unified national effort. England, though smaller, benefited from a more centralized administration and a growing sense of national identity, forged in part by the very conflict that now consumed them. Edward, a keen strategist, understood the importance of both military might and economic stability. He had secured alliances with Flemish towns, vital centers of wool production, by promising protection and trade advantages, further intertwining the economic fates of England and the Low Countries. These alliances, though often fragile and driven by self-interest, provided crucial financial backing and strategic footholds on the continent. The initial years of the war saw a series of chevauchées, devastating raids deep into French territory, designed not to hold ground, but to inflict economic damage, undermine the French king's authority, and draw out the enemy into a decisive battle. These were brutal affairs, leaving a trail of scorched earth and terrified villagers in their wake. The English army, though smaller than its French counterpart, was a more professional force, built around the formidable longbowmen, whose training began in childhood. Their bodies honed by years of practice, the longbow, a weapon of immense power and range, could pierce armor and rain down a storm of arrows, demoralizing and decimating enemy formations before they could even close for hand-to-hand combat. This was a stark contrast to the French reliance on heavily armored knights, whose individual prowess was legendary, but whose collective tactics were often less adaptable. As the summer of 1346 unfolded, Edward launched one of his most ambitious chevauchées yet. Landing in Normandy, he marched his army eastward, leaving a swath of destruction in his wake, sacking towns like Caen and threatening Paris itself. This audacious move was a gamble, designed to provoke Philip VI, the French king, into a direct confrontation. Philip, stung by the audacity of the English advance and pressured by his nobles, gathered a vast army, far outnumbering Edward's forces. The stage was set for a monumental clash, one that would echo through the annals of military history. The English army, weary from their march and laden with plunder, found themselves near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu in late August. Edward, recognizing the strategic advantage of the terrain, chose his ground carefully. He deployed his forces on a gentle slope, with flanks protected by natural obstacles and a small wood. His archers, numbering perhaps 7,000, were positioned in a wedge formation, stakes driven into the ground before them to break up cavalry charges. The dismounted English knights and men-at-arms formed a solid core behind them, ready to engage any enemy that managed to breach the arrow storm. This was a revolutionary tactical deployment, prioritizing the longbow's devastating power over the traditional shock of a cavalry charge. On August 26, 1346, the French army arrived, a vast, colorful host stretching for miles, their banners fluttering in the wind, their armor glinting in the afternoon sun. Philip VI, confident in his numerical superiority, ordered his Genoese crossbowmen to advance. These mercenaries, though skilled, were hampered by the need to reload their weapons, a slow and cumbersome process, and were without their protective pavises, which had been left behind with the baggage train. As they advanced, a sudden summer shower drenched the battlefield, making the ground muddy and the crossbow strings slack. When the order came, the English longbowmen, their bowstrings kept dry under their tunics, unleashed a torrent of arrows. The sound must have been like 1,000 angry hornets, a continuous, terrifying hum that filled the air. The Genoese, caught in the open, were cut down in droves, their retreat, understandable, given the horrifying barrage, was misinterpreted by the impatient French knights as cowardice. "Kill these scoundrels," Philip is said to have cried, and the French cavalry, eager for glory, charged through their own retreating crossbowmen, adding to the chaos. Wave after wave of French knights, their heavy armor a testament to their valor, but also a hindrance in the muddy terrain, launched desperate charges up the slope. They were met by an unyielding wall of arrows. Horses screamed, men fell, and the ground became a gruesome tableau of mangled bodies and broken lances. The English archers, constantly supplied with arrows by boys who ran back and forth from the baggage train, maintained a relentless pace. The sheer volume of fire was unprecedented. Historians still debate the exact number of arrows loosed that day, but estimates suggest hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1,000,000, transforming the sky into a lethal cloud. As dusk descended, the battle raged on, illuminated by the flickering light of torches and the cries of the wounded. The French, despite their immense courage, were unable to break the English lines. Their charges, often disorganized and piecemeal, lacked coordination and were systematically pulverized by the longbows. Philip VI himself was caught in the thick of the fighting, his horse killed from under him, and he was eventually led away from the field, a king defeated. The battle was a crushing English victory, a testament to the tactical genius of Edward III and the devastating effectiveness of the longbow. Thousands of French knights, including many of the highest nobility, lay dead on the field, a staggering loss that reverberated across Europe. Crécy was more than just a battle. It was a paradigm shift. It shattered the long-held belief in the invincibility of the armored knight and demonstrated the supremacy of disciplined infantry and missile weapons. It cemented England's reputation as a formidable military power and established the longbow as the iconic weapon of the 100 Years' War. The victory also had profound psychological effects. It boosted English morale to unprecedented levels and instilled a deep sense of national pride, while for the French, It was a humiliating and devastating blow, shaking their confidence and exposing the weaknesses in their military structure. The immediate aftermath of Crécy saw Edward III press his advantage. He marched his victorious army to the strategically important port city of Calais, which he besieged for 11 months. The siege was a grueling affair, a test of endurance for both sides. The citizens of Calais, cut off from supplies, endured terrible hardships, resorting to eating rats and other desperate measures. Edward, determined to secure a vital bridgehead into France, maintained a relentless pressure. The story of the burghers of Calais, who offered themselves as sacrifices to save their city, is a poignant tale of civic courage and royal clemency, though its exact details have been debated by chroniclers over the centuries. Ultimately, Calais fell in 1347, providing England with a crucial stronghold on the continent that would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, a constant thorn in the side of the French monarchy. The fall of Calais marked a temporary lull in the major campaigns. The Black Death, a devastating plague that swept across Europe in the late 1340s, would soon grip both England and France in its terrifying embrace, claiming millions of lives and temporarily overshadowing the ongoing conflict. The plague did not discriminate, striking down peasants and kings alike, emptying villages and disrupting the very fabric of society. It was a force of nature, far more potent than any army, and its arrival forced a temporary cessation of hostilities as both nations grappled with an unseen enemy. Yet even as the plague raged, the seeds of future conflict were being sown. The English victories at Sluys and Crécy and the capture of Calais had irrevocably altered the balance of power. Edward III had proven himself a formidable military leader, and his longbowmen had demonstrated a new, terrifying effectiveness on the battlefield. The French, though reeling, were far from defeated. The war had entered a new, more intense phase, one where the echoes of Crécy would continue to resonate, shaping strategies and inspiring future generations of soldiers. The landscape of northern France, once a tapestry of peaceful villages and rolling fields, had become a canvas for ambition, innovation, and unimaginable loss. And perhaps, in the quiet moments of the night, the wind still carried the faint, ghostly hum of a million arrows, a haunting reminder of the day the world changed at Crécy. The stage was set for the next chapter, one where the sons and grandsons of those who fought at Crécy would take up the mantle, continuing a conflict that had become deeply ingrained in the very identity of 2 nations. The war, now etched into the very soil of France, was far from over. As the year 1347 drew to a close, a shadow, far darker and more pervasive than any war machine, began to creep across the horizons of Europe. It was a shadow that would soon engulf both England and France, forcing a pause in their protracted conflict and reshaping the very fabric of their societies in ways no siege or battle ever could. Whispers from the east of a terrible pestilence had begun to reach the ears of merchants and sailors. They spoke of a sickness that struck swiftly, mercilessly, turning healthy bodies into grotesque effigies of suffering within days, sometimes even hours. This was the Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague that would decimate populations on an unprecedented scale. The plague arrived in Europe through trade routes, carried by fleas on rats that scurried aboard merchant ships. One of the earliest documented arrivals was in Messina, Sicily, in October 1347, when 12 Genoese galleys returning from the Black Sea docked in the harbor. The sailors on board were already gravely ill, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The stench of death hung heavy around the ships, and though the Messina authorities attempted to expel them, it was too late. The invisible killer had already disembarked. From there, it spread with terrifying speed, following trade routes inland, along rivers, and across land. By 1348, the plague had reached France, making landfall in Marseille, a bustling port city. The vibrant markets and narrow streets that once teemed with life soon became avenues of despair. The disease manifested in various forms. The bubonic plague, characterized by swollen, painful lymph nodes, buboes, often in the groin, armpit, or neck. Pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could spread directly from person to person through the air. And septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream, causing widespread internal bleeding and turning the skin black, hence the name Black Death. The sheer speed of its progression left communities reeling. Families watched helplessly as loved ones succumbed, often without time for proper goodbyes or burials. The English Channel, usually a barrier, proved no defense against this microscopic foe. The plague arrived in England in the summer of 1348, likely through the port of Melcombe Regis, modern-day Weymouth, in Dorset. It then advanced inexorably northward, reaching London by autumn. The city, with its dense population and unsanitary conditions, became a crucible of suffering. The air itself seemed to thicken with the smell of sickness and death. Church bells, once ringing out the hours of the day, now tolled almost constantly for the dead, until even the bell ringers themselves fell ill. The 100 Years' War, which had been raging intermittently for over a decade, was abruptly put on hold. The armies, already strained by campaigns and sieges, found themselves facing an enemy against which their swords and arrows were useless. Soldiers, gathered in close quarters, were particularly vulnerable. Garrisons were decimated, and the logistical nightmare of supplying and maintaining an army became impossible when the very people needed to produce and transport goods were dying. The grand strategies of kings and commanders suddenly seemed trivial in the face of such overwhelming devastation. Edward III of England and Philip VI of France, both of whom had seen their kingdoms brought to the brink by war, now faced an existential threat to their very populations. The immediate impact was a catastrophic loss of life. While precise figures are impossible to ascertain due to the lack of reliable census data, historians estimate that between 30% and 50% of Europe's total population perished during the initial wave of the Black Death between 1347 and 1351. Some regions suffered even higher mortality rates, with villages entirely wiped out, their fields left untended, their homes silent and empty. For England and France, already weakened by years of conflict, the demographic collapse was particularly acute. Imagine a bustling town, its streets filled with merchants, artisans, and farmers, suddenly reduced to a ghost town within a matter of months, perhaps even weeks. The sheer scale of death was incomprehensible to those who lived through it. Beyond the immediate death toll, the plague brought profound social and economic changes. Before the plague, Europe, particularly England and France, had experienced a period of population growth leading to land scarcity and an abundance of cheap labor. The feudal system, with its rigid hierarchy of lords and serfs, was deeply entrenched. Serfs were tied to the land, owing labor and loyalty to their lords in exchange for protection and a small plot to farm. But with the sudden, massive decline in population, the balance of power shifted dramatically. labor became incredibly scarce and therefore valuable. Those who survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Peasants, who had long been oppressed and exploited, could now demand higher wages, better working conditions, or even the right to move to another manor if their lord refused their demands. Lords, desperate to find people to work their fields and tend their livestock, were often forced to concede. This led to a gradual but significant weakening of the feudal system. The traditional bonds of servitude began to fray as the economic realities forced a re-evaluation of labor relations. In England, this shift was particularly evident. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, was a desperate attempt by the English Parliament to fix wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from demanding more. It was a clear sign of the ruling elite's anxiety over the changing economic landscape. However, the statute proved largely ineffective. The forces of supply and demand were too powerful to be legislated away. Despite fines and punishments, laborers continued to command higher wages, and the movement of people from one estate to another became more common, eroding the very foundations of serfdom. The plague also had a profound impact on urban centers. Cities, though often hit hardest by the disease due to their density, also saw significant changes. Guilds, which regulated trades and crafts, lost many of their skilled masters and apprentices. This created opportunities for newcomers, and sometimes led to a relaxation of strict entry requirements, fostering greater social mobility. The demand for goods and services remained, but the supply of labor to produce them was drastically reduced, leading to innovation in some areas and a greater reliance on less labor-intensive methods in others. The psychological and cultural effects were equally profound. The pervasive fear of death, the sight of so much suffering, and the inability of medicine or religion to stem the tide of the disease led to a crisis of faith for some, while others turned to extreme piety or flagellation, believing the plague was divine punishment. Art and literature of the period often depicted the danse macabre, or dance of death, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves, a stark reminder of mortality's indiscriminate nature. The traditional social order, which had always seemed divinely ordained, was shaken to its core. A lesser-known detail of the plague's impact is its effect on language and education. With the death of many Latin-speaking clergy and scholars, there was a subtle but significant shift towards the use of vernacular languages. In England, for instance, French had long been the language of the court, law, and administration since the Norman conquest. However, the plague disproportionately affected the educated classes and urban populations, many of whom were fluent in French. As new generations filled the gaps, often from less privileged backgrounds, where English was spoken, the dominance of French began to wane. This period saw strength, penning of English as the language of government and literature, paving the way for figures like Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote in Middle English, solidifying its place in the literary landscape. The immediate aftermath of the plague did not see a cessation of hostilities between England and France, but rather a significant lull. The sheer logistical challenge of raising and maintaining armies in a depopulated landscape was immense. Campaigns became smaller in scale, and periods of truce became more frequent and prolonged, not out of a newfound desire for peace, but out of necessity. The focus shifted from grand military conquests to internal recovery and the management of shattered economies. However, the underlying causes of the conflict, the English claim to the French throne and their desire to retain Gascony, remained. as populations slowly began to recover and new generations came of age. The impetus for war would eventually return, yet the world they inherited was fundamentally different from the one their parents had known. The feudal structures were weakened, labor was more empowered, and the psychological scars of the plague ran deep. Historians still debate the precise long-term impact of the Black Death on the trajectory of the 100 Years' War. Some argue that it merely delayed the inevitable, while others contend that the demographic and social upheavals it caused fundamentally altered the nature of warfare and the societies that waged it. Did the plague, by weakening the traditional feudal levies, contribute to the rise of professional armies in the later stages of the war? Perhaps. Did the increased value of labor make peasant revolts, such as the Jacquerie in France 1358 and the Peasants' Revolt in England 1381, more likely, as the common people, having tasted a newfound power, became less willing to accept their traditional subservient roles? It certainly seems plausible. The plague was not a single event, but a series of recurring epidemics that continued to afflict Europe for centuries, though none as devastating as the initial wave. Each recurrence reinforced the changes set in motion by the first, gradually chipping away at the old order. The memory of the Black Death, of the sudden, inexplicable loss of life, would linger in the collective consciousness for generations, influencing everything from religious practices to economic policy. So, as the fighting between England and France eventually resumed, it was not the same war. The landscapes were emptier, the labor force was different, and the very mindset of the people had been irrevocably altered. The Black Death had been a great equalizer, striking down lord and peasant, knight and commoner alike, reminding all of the fragility of life and the impermanence of even the most deeply entrenched social structures. It had disrupted the grand designs of kings and reshaped the destiny of nations, proving that sometimes the greatest forces of change are not found on the battlefield, but in the unseen world of microbes and the silent, relentless march of disease. The war would continue, but it would be waged by survivors, in a world forever marked by the shadow of death. The scent of damp earth and wood smoke clung to the air in the spring of 1358, a stark contrast to the burgeoning anger that festered in the French countryside. The defeat at Poitiers, the capture of King John II, and the crippling ransom demands had left the kingdom in disarray. With the king imprisoned in England, the Dauphin Charles, still young and inexperienced, struggled to assert control. The nobility, often preoccupied with their own squabbles and the defense of their individual strongholds, seemed distant, their privileges untouched by the common suffering. It was a time of immense hardship for the ordinary people. Taxes rose relentlessly, levied to pay for a war that brought only devastation, while marauding bands of unemployed soldiers, known as routiers, roamed freely, pillaging and burning without consequence. These mercenaries, often English, Gascon, or even French, were a scourge, their presence a constant reminder of a broken society. The traditional feudal protections offered by lords had withered, leaving the peasantry exposed and vulnerable. In the region of Beauvais, north of Paris, the simmering resentment finally boiled over. On May 28th, a small group of peasants, driven to desperation, confronted a handful of nobles. The exact spark remains debated by historians, perhaps a particularly brutal act of extortion, or a perceived insult too great to bear. What is certain is that the encounter quickly escalated. The peasants, armed with whatever crude tools they could find, scythes, pitchforks, clubs, turned on their tormentors. This initial uprising, small as it was, ignited a firestorm. News traveled swiftly through the villages and hamlets, carried by whispers and desperate cries. The movement swelled with astonishing speed, drawing in tens of thousands from Picardy, Champagne, and Île-de-France. They called themselves the Jacques, a derogatory term for peasants, embracing it as a defiant symbol of their unity. This was the Jacquerie, a furious, spontaneous eruption of popular fury against a system that had failed them. The Jacquerie was not a coordinated military campaign, but a series of localized revolts, often brutal and chaotic. Their targets were the symbols of their oppression: the castles, the manors, the noble families themselves. Tales, perhaps exaggerated by chroniclers seeking to demonize the rebels, spread of atrocities committed, of nobles murdered, their homes razed. The peasants, long accustomed to being treated as little more than chattel, now sought to dismantle the very foundations of the feudal order. They lacked leadership, a clear political agenda, or military training, yet their sheer numbers and the raw intensity of their rage made them a formidable, if fleeting, force. One figure, Guillaume Caille, or Karl, emerged as a nominal leader, a man of humble origins, but possessing a degree of practical wisdom. He attempted, with limited success, to bring some semblance of order to the chaotic uprising, urging strategy over wanton destruction. He understood that their strength lay in numbers, but also their vulnerability to organized resistance. The nobility, initially caught off guard by the ferocity and scale of the revolt, soon rallied. Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad, a figure of complex and often treacherous loyalties, saw an opportunity to enhance his own power. Though ostensibly a French noble, he had his own claims to the French throne and was often aligned with the English. He gathered forces, including mercenaries and knights, and moved to crush the rebellion. On June 10th, near Mello in the Oise Valley, the forces of Navarre met the main body of the Jacquerie. The confrontation was brief and bloody. The poorly armed and undisciplined peasants were no match for trained knights and professional soldiers. Guillaume Caille, attempting to negotiate, was captured through treachery, lured into a parley only to be seized. Without their leader and facing a disciplined charge, the peasant ranks broke and fled. The ensuing massacre was horrific. Estimates vary, but thousands of peasants were cut down, their dreams of justice extinguished in a torrent of blood. The suppression of the Jacquerie was swift and brutal, a stark reminder of the immense power disparity between the social classes. The nobility, shaken by the uprising, exacted a terrible revenge, further solidifying their control and leaving a deep scar on the collective memory of the French peasantry. Meanwhile, the political landscape in Paris was equally turbulent. The Estates General, the representative assembly of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commoners, had been summoned in the wake of Poitiers, led by Etienne Marcel, a wealthy merchant and provost of the merchants of Paris. The Third Estate sought to assert greater control over the kingdom's finances and administration, effectively limiting the power of the Dauphin. Marcel, a charismatic and ambitious figure, envisioned a more constitutional monarchy, where the king's power was checked by the will of the people, or at least the wealthy burghers of Paris. He introduced a series of reforms, known as the Great Ordinance of 1357, which aimed to curb royal abuses, establish a council to oversee the Dauphin, and regularize taxation. For a brief period, it seemed as though France might embark on a path towards a more representative government, a truly fascinating deviation from the typical feudal power structures of the time. However, Marcel's ambitions ultimately outstripped his support. His alliance with Charles the Bad, seen by many as a dangerous opportunist, alienated some of his moderate allies. When Marcel ordered the assassination of two of the Dauphin's marshals, his actions became too radical for many, even those who initially supported reform. The Dauphin, who had initially fled Paris, began to gather strength outside the city, drawing on the loyalty of the nobility and those wary of Marcel's increasingly autocratic rule within the capital. The Parisians, witnessing the chaos and the growing instability, began to turn against Marcel. In July 1358, as the Dauphin prepared to besiege Paris, Etienne Marcel was himself assassinated by a Parisian mob, effectively ending the attempt at radical reform. The Dauphin Charles, now free of Marcel's influence, re-entered Paris and began the arduous task of restoring order to a kingdom fractured by war, peasant revolt, and political intrigue. His experiences during this tumultuous period, particularly the humiliation at the hands of the Estates General and the threat posed by Marcel, would profoundly shape his future reign, making him wary of any attempts to limit royal authority. He would become known as Charles V, Charles the Wise, a king who learned from adversity. With France in such a weakened state, England under King Edward III saw an opportunity to press its advantage. The capture of King John II provided an enormous bargaining chip. Negotiations for his release had been ongoing since Poitiers, but the terms demanded by Edward were exorbitant. He sought not only a massive ransom, but also vast territorial concessions, effectively demanding sovereignty over much of southwestern France, including Aquitaine, Poitou, and Calais, in full sovereignty, not merely as a feudal vassal. These demands were a clear escalation of English war aims, moving beyond mere feudal claims to outright annexation. The French, despite their desperate situation, initially resisted such humiliating terms. However, the economic devastation, the political instability, and the ongoing threat of renewed English campaigns left them with little leverage. In 1359, Edward III launched his final great invasion of France. This was not a campaign of conquest in the traditional sense, but a grand chevauchée, a devastating raid designed to force the French to the negotiating table. Edward landed at Calais with a massive army, perhaps the largest he had ever commanded, and marched through Artois, Champagne, and Burgundy. His aim was not to capture cities, but to lay waste to the countryside, to burn crops, destroy villages, and instill such terror and economic ruin that the French would have no choice but to accept his terms. The English army, well provisioned and disciplined, moved with methodical destruction, leaving a trail of smoke and desolation in its wake. The French, under the Dauphin Charles, adopted a cautious strategy, refusing to engage in open battle. They remembered the lessons of Crécy and Poitiers. Direct confrontation with the English longbowmen was a gamble they could not afford. Instead, they fortified their cities, harassed English supply lines, and waited. The winter of 1359 to 1360 was exceptionally harsh. The English army, despite its initial successes, began to suffer. Supplies dwindled, disease spread through the ranks, and the relentless cold took its toll. The very destruction they had wrought now worked against them, as there was little left to forage. As Edward's army approached Paris, the Dauphin remained resolute, refusing to be drawn out. The English found themselves bogged down, unable to force a decisive engagement. The campaign, despite its destructive power, was not achieving its ultimate political objective. It was a stalemate, but one that was slowly draining English resources and morale. Finally, in May 1360, exhausted and facing dwindling supplies, Edward III agreed to open serious negotiations. The talks took place in Brétigny, a village near Chartres. The ensuing agreement, known as the Treaty of Brétigny, marked a significant turning point in the 100 Years' War. It was a moment of profound humiliation for France, but also a temporary respite from the relentless conflict. The terms were harsh. King John II's ransom was set at an astronomical 3 million gold écus, to be paid in installments. More significantly, France ceded vast territories to England in full sovereignty, including the Duchy of Aquitaine, which encompassed Gascony, Poitou, Périgord, Limousin, Quercy, and Saintonge, as well as Calais and the county of Ponthieu. In return, Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne. This was a crucial concession, as it transformed the nature of the conflict from a dynastic struggle for the crown into a more conventional territorial dispute. The Treaty of Brétigny was signed on May 8, 1360, and ratified by both kings at Calais in October of the same year. For a time, it seemed as though peace had finally descended upon the war-weary lands. The treaty effectively created a vast English domain in southwestern France, a powerful wedge driven into the heart of the French kingdom. The English, for their part, believed they had achieved their primary objectives, securing their territorial claims and a massive ransom. The French, though deeply wounded by the concessions, gained a much-needed period of peace to rebuild their shattered kingdom and consolidate the Dauphin Charles's authority. The immediate impact was a cessation of large-scale hostilities, allowing communities to begin the slow, painful process of recovery. Fields could be replanted, homes rebuilt, and trade routes re-established. However, the underlying tensions remained, and the peace, as history would soon reveal, was fragile, a mere pause in a conflict that had already reshaped the destinies of two nations. The treaty's terms, particularly the renunciation of the English claim to the French throne, would prove to be a point of contention and would ultimately be disregarded when hostilities resumed. The stage was set for the next act of this long and arduous drama. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the war-torn landscapes of France, a new chapter began to unfold, one marked by a quiet resurgence of hope and a determined will to reclaim what had been lost. The Treaty of Brétigny, once hailed as a beacon of peace, had instead sown seeds of discontent, its harsh terms leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of the French. Yet, from this very bitterness, a new strength began to emerge, embodied by a young king, Charles V, who would later be known as Charles the Wise. Unlike his father, John II, who had been captured at Poitiers, Charles was a scholar and a strategist, more comfortable with books and maps than with the clang of swords. He understood that direct confrontation with the English, still formidable in their military prowess, was a path to ruin. Instead, he envisioned a different kind of war, one fought not with grand battles, but with patience, cunning, and a relentless chipping away at English gains. His reign, beginning in 1364, was a period of subtle yet profound transformation. Charles V inherited a kingdom in disarray, ravaged by war, plague, and the depredations of mercenary companies. The English held vast swathes of French territory, and their influence loomed large. Yet Charles possessed a quiet determination, a keen intellect, and an uncanny ability to choose the right people for the right tasks. He meticulously reorganized the royal finances, ensuring a steady stream of revenue to fund his campaigns. He reformed the army, moving away from the reliance on feudal levies and towards a more professional, disciplined force. He also invested heavily in artillery, recognizing its growing importance in siege warfare. But perhaps his greatest contribution was his selection of a military leader who would become the embodiment of French resistance, Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin was a remarkable figure, a Breton knight of humble origins, known more for his brute strength and unwavering loyalty than for aristocratic lineage. He was not the stereotypical chivalrous knight. His appearance was said to be rather plain, even homely, and his manners rough. Yet, his strategic mind was sharp, and his understanding of guerrilla warfare, honed in years of skirmishes and mercenary service, was unparalleled. He understood the terrain, the psychology of his opponents, and the weariness of a populace yearning for peace. Charles V, with his intellectual approach, found in Du Guesclin the perfect complement, a pragmatic, effective field commander who could translate the king's strategic vision into tangible victories. Their partnership marked the beginning of what historians often refer to as the Caroline War, a phase of the 100 Years' War that saw a systematic reversal of English fortunes. Du Guesclin's strategy was a stark contrast to the grand open-field battles favored by the English. He avoided pitched engagements, knowing that the English longbowmen and dismounted knights were still a formidable force. Instead, he embraced a strategy of attrition, known as the Fabian strategy, after the Roman general Fabius Maximus. This involved harassing English garrisons, ambushing supply convoys, and besieging isolated strongholds. He would strike swiftly, then melt away, denying the English the decisive battle they craved. One of Du Guesclin's early successes came in 1364, even before Charles V's full reign at the Battle of Coquerel. Here he decisively defeated a Navarrese English force led by John of Grailly, the Captal de Buch, a highly respected English commander. This victory, though not a major turning point in the war, boosted French morale and demonstrated Du Guesclin's tactical prowess. It was a sign of things to come, a testament to the effectiveness of his more flexible and less conventional approach to warfare. The systematic Reconquest began in earnest in the late 1360s. Charles V, through careful diplomacy, managed to draw various French nobles and towns away from their allegiance to the English crown. He appealed to their sense of French identity, their shared language, and their desire for stability. The English, under Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, were increasingly stretched thin. Their vast territorial gains, while impressive on paper, were difficult to govern and defend. The local populations, weary of foreign rule and heavy taxes, often welcomed the French forces. Du Guesclin, appointed Constable of France in 1370, became the architect of this reconquest. He moved methodically, province by province, town by town. He targeted English strongholds in Poitou, Saintonge, and Limousin, areas that had been ceded to England by the Treaty of Brétigny. His sieges were relentless, often employing the newly improved French artillery to batter down castle walls. Unlike the English, who often relied on devastating raids and plunder to force submission, Du Guesclin aimed for sustained occupation and integration. The campaign in Poitou in 1372 was particularly effective. Du Guesclin, alongside other French commanders like Olivier de Clisson, systematically captured towns and castles. The English, under the command of John of Gaunt, Edward III's son, found themselves constantly reacting to French initiatives. They struggled to mount effective counteroffensives, their forces dispersed and their resources strained. The French, on the other hand, were fighting on home ground, supported by the local populace and fueled by a renewed sense of national purpose. One of the lesser-known but significant events of this period was the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372. This was not a land battle, but a decisive naval victory for the Franco-Castilian fleet over an English fleet. The English, attempting to resupply their garrisons in Aquitaine, were intercepted and utterly defeated. This victory was crucial because it severed English sea lines of communication, making it incredibly difficult to reinforce their troops and transport supplies to their continental possessions. It effectively isolated the remaining English strongholds in the southwest of France, paving the way for further French advances. The loss of naval supremacy was a severe blow to English power projection and a testament to the multifaceted approach Charles V was taking to the war. The strategic brilliance of Charles V lay in his understanding that the war was not just about military might, but also about economic stability, political maneuvering, and public opinion. He understood the psychological toll of continuous warfare on both sides. While the English were accustomed to their victorious raids and grand campaigns, they were ill-suited to the patient, grinding nature of Du Guesclin's attrition warfare. The constant skirmishes, the loss of minor garrisons, and the inability to force a decisive engagement began to wear down English morale and resources. By 1374, much of what had been lost at Brétigny had been reclaimed. The English presence in France was largely confined to a few coastal enclaves such as Calais and Bordeaux, and a narrow strip of territory in Gascony. The vast Duchy of Aquitaine, once the jewel in the English crown, had been systematically dismantled. The English, facing internal dissent and the declining health of Edward III and the Black Prince, found themselves on the defensive. However, historians still debate the precise extent to which Charles V's success was due to his own strategic genius versus the declining fortunes and internal weaknesses of the English crown. Was it primarily Charles's meticulous planning and Du Guesclin's tactical brilliance that turned the tide, or was it the growing infirmity of Edward III, the premature death of the Black Prince, and the increasing financial strain on England that truly allowed France to recover? Perhaps it was a confluence of both, a perfect storm of French resurgence meeting English decline. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. A testament to how complex historical forces often intertwine, the final years of Charles V's reign, before his death in 1380, saw the consolidation of these gains. He had not only recovered territory, but had also restored the prestige and authority of the French monarchy. He had rebuilt the administrative structures of the kingdom, fostered a sense of national unity, and laid the groundwork for future stability. His quiet, scholarly nature belied a fierce determination and a profound understanding of statecraft. He was a king who understood that true power lay not just in military victories, but in the careful management of resources, the cultivation of loyalty, and the strategic patience to outlast an opponent. The legacy of Charles V and Bertrand du Guesclin was immense. They had reversed the tide of a war that had seemed hopelessly lost. They had shown that resilience, strategic thinking, and a willingness to adapt could overcome even the most formidable adversaries. Du Guesclin, in particular, became a national hero, a symbol of French resistance and ingenuity. His tactics, though initially unconventional, proved devastatingly effective against the more traditional English approach. He embodied the spirit of a nation fighting for its very survival, a spirit that would continue to burn brightly in the decades to come. As the 14th century drew to a close, the landscape of France, though still bearing the scars of decades of conflict, began to breathe again. The English strongholds, once seemingly impregnable, had fallen one by one, their flags replaced by the fleur-de-lis. The whispers of despair had been replaced by murmurs of hope, and the fields, once fallow, began to yield their bounty once more. Perhaps the very stones of the reclaimed castles sighed with relief, their ancient walls witnessing the slow, arduous process of healing and renewal. The lessons learned during this period of reconquest, the importance of strategic patience, the value of unconventional warfare, and the power of a united purpose would resonate through the remaining decades of the 100 Years' War, shaping the destiny of two great nations. As the 14th century drew to a close, the very bedrock of Christendom began to fracture, not from external pressures, but from within its own hallowed halls. This internal rupture, known to history as the Great Schism, would cast a long, unsettling shadow over the ongoing struggles between England and France, intertwining spiritual crisis with temporal conflict. For decades, the papacy, once a singular unifying beacon, had been resident in Avignon under the perceived influence of the French crown. Yet, in 1378, following the death of Gregory XI, who had finally returned the papal seat to Rome, a tumultuous election unfolded. The Roman populace, fearing the return of the papacy to Avignon, exerted immense pressure on the cardinals, demanding an Italian pope. Urban VI was elected, but his abrasive personality and radical reforms quickly alienated many cardinals. Within months, a group of these disaffected cardinals, claiming duress, declared Urban's election invalid and elected a new pope, Clement VII, who promptly returned to Avignon. Suddenly, Europe found itself with two popes, each claiming legitimate authority, each excommunicating the other, and each demanding the allegiance of the faithful. This was not merely a theological dispute, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Kings and princes were forced to choose sides, and their choices often reflected existing political alliances and rivalries. France, naturally, sided with the Avignon papacy, as did its allies, Scotland and Castile. England, in direct opposition to France, threw its support behind the Roman Pope, as did the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, and most of Italy. The schism thus deepened the existing animosities of the 100 Years' War, transforming it into a conflict not just of crowns and territories, but of spiritual allegiances. Soldiers fighting on the battlefield might now view their enemies not merely as foreign combatants, but as adherents of a schismatic pope, further demonizing the opposition and hardening hearts. Imagine the confusion and despair this wrought upon the common people. For centuries, the Church had been the ultimate authority, the guide to salvation. Now, two men, both claiming to be God's vicar on earth, denounced each other as antichrists. Parish priests were caught in an impossible bind, often forced to choose allegiance based on the dictates of their local lord or king, rather than theological conviction. The flow of tithes and offerings became a point of contention, with funds diverted to one papal court or the other, further enriching the competing curias, while the spiritual needs of the populace often went unaddressed. This period saw a significant decline in moral authority for the Church, paving the way for later reform movements, but in the immediate term it sowed widespread cynicism and anxiety. Historians still debate the precise psychological impact of the schism on the average European, but it is clear that it fostered a sense of profound instability, a feeling that the very fabric of the cosmos was unraveling. Perhaps these anxieties whispered through the darkened streets of Paris and London, adding a layer of spiritual dread to the already palpable fear of war and plague. Within England, the internal divisions were exacerbated by the lingering effects of the Black Death and the social unrest it had spawned. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though brutally suppressed, left a deep scar on the English psyche, revealing the fragility of the social order and the simmering resentments of the lower classes against oppressive taxation and feudal burdens. Richard II, who had shown remarkable courage in confronting the rebels as a young king, grew increasingly autocratic in the years that followed. His reign became marked by a profound distrust of his nobles, a penchant for favorites, and an extravagant lifestyle that alienated many. He sought to centralize power, bypassing traditional parliamentary authority and imposing his will, lay through personal decree. One lesser-known detail of his reign is his fascination with the cult of Edward the Confessor, whom he sought to emulate, even adopting the confessor's mythical arms. This desire to connect with an idealized past, perhaps to legitimize his increasingly absolute rule, ultimately backfired. Richard's arbitrary rule culminated in the exile and disinheritance of Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, one of the most powerful magnates in the realm. When Gaunt died in 1399, Richard seized his vast estates, an act that was seen as a profound violation of feudal law and a direct threat to the security of all noble inheritances. This act of blatant tyranny proved to be the final straw. Bolingbroke, seizing the opportunity while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, returned to England with a small force, ostensibly to reclaim his rightful inheritance. However, he quickly garnered widespread support from disaffected nobles and commoners alike. Richard, returning to find his kingdom turned against him, was captured and forced to abdicate. Henry Bolingbroke ascended the throne as Henry IV, marking the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty. This internal upheaval, the deposition of a king, temporarily diverted English attention and resources away from the war with France. As the new monarch sought to consolidate his precarious hold on power against various rebellions and conspiracies. Across the Channel, France too wrestled with its own internal demons, though of a different nature. Charles VI, who had ascended the throne in 1380, inherited a kingdom still reeling from decades of war and the recent ravages of the plague. Initially, his reign showed promise, with a period of relative peace and attempts at administrative reform. However, in 1392, Charles suffered his first major bout of madness, an incident famously triggered by a perceived assassination attempt and exacerbated by the heat and stress of a summer campaign. This episode, during which he attacked his own knights, marked the beginning of a lifelong struggle with intermittent bouts of insanity, earning him the moniker Charles the Mad or Charles the Beloved, a testament to the enduring affection of his people despite his affliction. The king's incapacitation plunged the French court into chaos. With the monarch unable to rule effectively, a power vacuum emerged, swiftly filled by ambitious members of the royal family, primarily his uncles and his younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans. The Regency Council, dominated by powerful princes, became a hotbed of intrigue and factionalism. Two main factions emerged: the Armagnacs, led by Louis of Orleans, and later by Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, and the Burgundians, led by Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and later by his son, John the Fearless. The Burgundian dukes, through strategic marriages and territorial acquisitions, had amassed immense power and wealth, controlling vast territories that stretched from the Low Countries down into France, making them virtually independent princes. The rivalry between the Orleans and Burgundy factions was not merely a squabble over influence. It was a bitter, personal feud fueled by ambition, greed, and ultimately, blood. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was a particularly ruthless and pragmatic figure. He harbored a deep resentment towards Louis of Orleans, who, as the king's brother, held significant sway and was rumored to be having an affair with the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. John the Fearless orchestrated the brutal assassination of Louis of Orleans in the streets of Paris. This shocking act of fratricide within the royal family ignited a full-blown civil war in France, known as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. the streets of Paris became battlegrounds, with citizens forced to choose sides, often at great peril. The city itself suffered immensely from the constant shifts in power, the massacres, and the economic disruption. The Civil War in France was a catastrophic blow to the kingdom's ability to resist English aggression. While England was undergoing its own dynastic struggles under Henry IV, the French Civil War was far more debilitating. The two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, were so consumed by their mutual hatred that they often sought external allies, even if it meant betraying their own country. The Burgundians, in particular, began to flirt with the idea of an alliance with England, seeing it as a means to gain an advantage over their Armagnac rivals. This internal strife provided a golden opportunity for the English crown. The French state, once a formidable opponent, was now fragmented and bleeding from within, its resources depleted, its leadership divided, and its people exhausted by endless conflict. The Great Schism, meanwhile, continued to plague Europe, even as the new century dawned. Various attempts were made to heal the rift, but each proved insufficient. Councils were convened, but the competing popes refused to yield. The Council of Pisa in 1409, an attempt to resolve the issue by electing a third pope, only succeeded in creating three rival pontiffs, further deepening the crisis and solidifying the perception of papal incompetence and corruption. It was a period of profound spiritual disorientation, where the very concept of religious unity seemed to crumble. This spiritual disarray undoubtedly contributed to the overall sense of malaise and instability that permeated the era, making the political and military conflicts seem even more intractable. The question of who was the true vicar of Christ was not just a theological puzzle. It had real-world implications for oaths, treaties, and the legitimacy of rulers who had sworn fealty to one pope or another. The internal divisions within both England and France, amplified by the pervasive spiritual uncertainty of the Great Schism, fundamentally altered the trajectory of the 100 Years' War. The period from the late 14th century into the early 15th century was less about grand campaigns and more about internal consolidation and the exploitation of enemy weakness. Henry IV of England, preoccupied with rebellions at home and a constant struggle for legitimacy, could not fully capitalize on France's woes. His reign was marked by a series of challenges to his authority, including the formidable Welsh rebellion led by Owen Glyndwr, which tied up significant English resources for years. This obscure detail of Welsh resistance, often overshadowed by the larger Anglo-French conflict, nonetheless played a crucial role in limiting England's offensive capabilities during this period of French vulnerability. Yet, the stage was being set for a dramatic shift. The French Civil War, with its brutal assassinations and shifting alliances, was slowly but surely exhausting the kingdom. The Armagnacs and Burgundians, though both French, were locked in a death struggle that transcended national loyalty. The Burgundians, with their vast economic power derived from the wealthy towns of Flanders, increasingly pursued their own interests, which often diverged from those of the French crown. This fractured state, a kingdom tearing itself apart from within, would soon present an irresistible target for a new, ambitious English king, one who would emerge from the Lancastrian dynasty with a renewed sense of purpose and a clear vision for reclaiming the lost glories of his ancestors. The long night of internal strife and spiritual schism was drawing to a close, but the dawn it heralded would bring not peace, but a renewed and even more devastating phase of the Long War. The echoes of the past, the claims of Edward III, and the deep-seated animosities were about to be rekindled with a ferocity that would forever alter the destinies of both nations. The dawn of the 15th century found England restless, its gaze still fixed across the narrow stretch of water that separated it from the ancient claims of its kings. The brief, uneasy truce that had settled over the 100 Years' War was fraying, a delicate tapestry worn thin by decades of simmering resentment and unresolved ambition. It was into this charged atmosphere that Henry V ascended to the English throne in 1413, a young monarch whose very presence seemed to embody a renewed vigor, a fresh determination to reclaim what he believed was his birthright. Unlike some of his predecessors, Henry was not merely content to skirmish or defend. He envisioned a grander conquest, a decisive blow that would finally settle the long-standing dispute over the French crown. His ambitions were not born of simple greed, but rather a complex blend of dynastic pride, political necessity, and perhaps a genuine belief in the justice of his cause. England, though relatively stable after the turbulent reign of his father, Henry IV, still harbored internal divisions. A successful foreign campaign, particularly one against the age-old enemy, could unite a fractured nobility and solidify his grip on power. Moreover, the political landscape of France itself offered a tantalizing opportunity. The French kingdom was embroiled in its own bitter civil war, a devastating conflict between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians that had left the country weakened, its royal authority diminished, and its people weary. This internal strife, a wound that festered even as the English prepared their invasion, was a crucial factor in Henry's audacious plan. In the summer of 1415, Henry V launched his invasion, a meticulously planned enterprise that aimed to seize the strategic port of Harfleur, a gateway to the heart of Normandy. His army, though smaller than the grand forces of earlier campaigns, was well-trained and disciplined, a professional fighting machine honed by years of internal conflict and border skirmishes. The siege of Harfleur proved to be a grueling affair, a test of endurance against stubborn French resistance and the ravages of dysentery, which swept through the English ranks with brutal efficiency. Many brave soldiers, weakened by disease, succumbed not to enemy blades, but to the invisible killer that lurked in the unsanitary conditions of the camp. After a month of relentless bombardment and fierce fighting, Harfleur finally fell. Yet, the cost was high. The English army, though victorious, was significantly depleted, its strength sapped by sickness and the prolonged siege. With Harfleur secured, Henry faced a critical decision. His original plan had been to march deeper into France, but his reduced forces made such an advance perilous. Instead, he chose a daring, almost reckless maneuver, a march across northern France to the English-held port of Calais, a journey of some 150 miles through enemy territory. This was not a strategic advance, but a calculated risk, a direct challenge to the French to meet him in open battle. He aimed to draw them out, to force a decisive engagement on his terms, or at least to parade his army's strength before them, a defiant gesture of English resolve. The French, however, were not idle. As Henry's army trudged northward, their path was shadowed by a much larger French force, a vast feudal army hastily assembled from the various factions, momentarily united by the common threat. The French commanders, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, sought to block Henry's passage, to corner him and annihilate his weary troops. They finally positioned themselves near the village of Agincourt, their vast numbers spreading across the narrow plain, effectively cutting off the English route to Calais. The stage was set for one of the most iconic battles in history. On October 25, 1415, the feast day of St. Crispin, The two armies faced each other across a muddy, recently plowed field. The English, numb, erring perhaps 6,000 to 9,000 men, were outnumbered by the French, whose forces are estimated to have been between 12,000 and 30,000, though some historians argue the disparity was even greater. The ground itself played a crucial role. Recent rains had turned the fields into a quagmire, a thick, clinging mud that would prove to be a significant impediment, particularly for the heavily armored French knights. Henry V, a charismatic and inspiring leader, addressed his troops, reminding them of their cause and their courage. He positioned his archers, the backbone of his army, on the flanks, driving sharpened stakes into the ground before them to deter cavalry charges. The English longbow, a weapon that had proven its devastating effectiveness at Crécy and Poitiers, was once again to be unleashed. The French, confident in their numbers and their chivalric traditions, launched their attack. Wave after wave of heavily armored knights, eager for glory, charged across the muddy field. But the ground, churned into a bog by thousands of hooves and feet, quickly became a death trap. The knights, weighed down by their armor, struggled to advance, their movements hampered, their formations broken. Then came the storm of arrows. The English longbowmen, firing at an incredible rate, unleashed a continuous volley of deadly shafts that rained down upon the struggling French. The arrows pierced armor, found gaps in joints, and struck horses, throwing the French ranks into disarray. The sheer volume of fire was overwhelming, creating a terrifying cacophony of thudding arrows, screams of men and horses, and the clang of steel. As the French vanguard faltered, the English archers, many of whom were lightly armored, dropped their bows and charged forward with axes and swords, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat against the bogged-down knights. The narrowness of the battlefield, flanked by woods, further funneled the French into a confined space, preventing them from effectively deploying their superior numbers. The sheer press of bodies, trapped in the mud and under relentless attack, led to a horrific crush, with many French soldiers suffocating or being trampled to death even before they reached the English lines. The Battle of Agincourt was a catastrophic defeat for France and a stunning victory for England. The flower of French nobility was decimated, thousands killed or captured. The casualty figures are staggering. Estimates suggest that over 6,000 French soldiers, including many prominent nobles, perished, while English losses were remarkably light, perhaps only a few hundred. The battle solidified Henry V's reputation as a military genius and sent shockwaves across Europe. It was a testament to the power of the longbow, the effectiveness of disciplined infantry, and the strategic brilliance of a king who understood the terrain and the limitations of his enemy. Following Agincourt, Henry V did not immediately press his advantage deep into France. Instead, he returned to England, consolidating his gains and preparing for the next phase of his campaign. The victory, however, had irrevocably altered the balance of power. France, reeling from the loss of so many of its leaders and knights, was in disarray. The civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians intensified, further weakening the kingdom. This internal strife provided Henry with the perfect opportunity to systematically conquer Normandy, a region that had once been the ancestral home of English kings. Over the next few years, Henry V embarked on a meticulous and successful campaign to subdue Normandy. He was not a king who relied solely on grand battles. He was also a skilled administrator and diplomat. He employed a strategy of siege warfare, capturing towns and castles one by one, slowly but surely extending English control. His forces were well supplied and disciplined, and he often offered generous terms to surrendering garrisons, aiming to win over the populace rather than and simply devastate the land. This calculated approach, combined with the continued weakness and division within France, allowed him to make significant territorial gains. The French royal family, particularly King Charles VI, was in a precarious position. Charles VI, often referred to as Charles the Mad, suffered from debilitating bouts of mental illness, leaving a power vacuum that intensified the factional struggles. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, found herself navigating a treacherous political landscape, often making decisions that were viewed as detrimental to French interests. The Dauphin, Charles, the future Charles VII, was largely disinherited and sidelined by the ongoing internal conflicts. It was against this backdrop of French weakness and English strength that the Treaty of Troyes was negotiated in 1420. This treaty, a truly remarkable document, represented the pinnacle of Henry V's ambitions and the nadir of French royal authority. Under its terms, Henry V was to marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of King Charles VI and Queen Isabeau. More significantly, the treaty declared Henry V to be the regent and heir to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin Charles. It stipulated that upon the death of Charles VI, the crown of France would pass to Henry V and his heirs, thereby uniting the crowns of England and France under a single Anglo-French monarchy. The Treaty of Troyes was a momentous achievement for Henry V, seemingly fulfilling the long-held English claim to the French throne. It was a diplomatic triumph, secured not only by military might, but also by the deep divisions within the French ruling class. The Burgundians, a powerful faction who had allied themselves with the English after the assassination of their duke, Joan the Fearless, were instrumental in pushing for the treaty, seeing it as a way to undermine their Armagnac rivals and bring an end to the devastating civil war. For the French, particularly the Armagnacs and those loyal to the Dauphin, the treaty was a humiliation, a betrayal of their national sovereignty. They refused to recognize its legitimacy, arguing that Charles VI, in his state of mental incapacity, could not legally disinherit his own son. This fundamental disagreement ensured that even with the treaty signed, the conflict was far from over. The war, which had become a struggle for the very identity of France, would continue. Henry V, now officially the heir to France, continued to campaign, seeking to enforce the terms of the treaty and bring all of France under his control. He was a king at the height of his power, seemingly destined to forge a new Anglo-French empire. However, fate, as it often does, intervened. In 1422, at the age of just 35, Henry V succumbed to dysentery, the same disease that had plagued his army at Harfleur while on campaign in France. His sudden death was a profound shock, not only to England, but to the entire European political landscape. Just 2 months later, the ailing Charles VI of France also died. The deaths of both kings within such a short span of time threw the carefully constructed terms of the Treaty of Troyes into immediate crisis. Henry V's infant son, Henry VI, became king of both England and, by the terms of the treaty, France. However, the Dauphin Charles, still disinherited, but now with a renewed sense of purpose, immediately proclaimed himself King Charles VII of France. The stage was set for a new, even more complex phase of the 100 Years' War. A war of succession that would pit an infant king and his regents against a determined, though initially weak, French claimant, and ultimately lead to the emergence of an unlikely savior for France. The legacy of Henry V and the Agincourt campaign is one of audacious ambition, military brilliance, and a brief, tantalizing glimpse of a united Anglo-French monarchy. His reign, though tragically short, irrevocably shaped the course of the war, pushing England to the zenith of its power in France. Yet his early death also created a power vacuum that would, paradoxically, allow France to begin its slow, arduous journey towards national unity and eventual victory. The Treaty of Troyes, meant to be the definitive end to the conflict, instead became a catalyst for its final, most desperate phase. A phase that would see the emergence of a figure who would defy all expectations and change the very nature of the war. The scent of damp earth clung to the air, mingling with the distant echoes of war, as a new, unexpected light began to flicker across the weary landscape of France. For decades, the English had seemed invincible, their longbows raining death, their armies marching deeper into French territory. The French king, Charles VII, was a king in name only, his court a shadow, his authority barely extending beyond the walls of Bourges. Hope was a fragile thing, easily extinguished by the persistent chill of defeat. But then a voice began to speak, not from a general nor a noble, but from a simple peasant girl in the quiet village of Domremy. Her name was Joan, and she heard voices, she said, divine voices, urging her to save France. Born around 1412, Joan of Arc grew up amidst the constant hum of conflict, her childhood shaped by the 100 Years' War. She was barely a teenager when she began to experience visions and hear what she believed were the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These celestial messengers, she claimed, instructed her to lift the siege of Orléans and lead the Dauphin, Charles, to his coronation at Reims. It was an extraordinary, almost unbelievable claim, especially coming from an uneducated girl from the remote borderlands of Lorraine. How could a girl, who had never wielded a sword nor commanded a single soldier, possibly alter the course of such a devastating war? Yet her conviction was absolute, her resolve unwavering. Initially, her pleas were met with skepticism, even ridicule. She first approached Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of Vaucouleurs, in 1428, asking for an escort to the Dauphin's court. He dismissed her, telling her to go home to her father. But Joan persisted, her simple faith and unwavering determination slowly chipping away at the cynicism of those around her. She spoke of prophecies, of a virgin who would save France, and as the situation in Orléans grew increasingly desperate, her words began to resonate with a population yearning for a miracle. Eventually, Baudricourt, perhaps swayed by the growing popular belief in her divine mission, or perhaps simply desperate enough to try anything, granted her an escort to Chinon, where the Dauphin resided. The journey to Chinon was perilous, through enemy-held territory, but Joan, dressed in men's clothing for protection, arrived safely in February 1429. Here she faced her greatest test. Charles VII, wary and surrounded by cynical advisors, famously attempted to trick her by disguising himself among his courtiers. But Joan, with an uncanny certainty, walked directly to him, knelt, and declared her mission. She spoke not of strategy or tactics, but of divine will, of a sacred duty to reclaim France. The court was astonished. Still, Charles was cautious. He subjected her to rigorous theological examinations by a panel of clerics in Poitiers. For 3 weeks, they questioned her, probing her faith, her visions, her intentions. Joan, despite her lack of formal education, answered with clarity and conviction, her simple yet profound responses often baffling her learned interrogators. She passed their scrutiny, her piety and sincerity shining through. The situation at Orléans, meanwhile, was dire. The city, a strategic stronghold on the Loire River, had been under English siege since October 1428. Its fall would effectively open the entire south of France to English conquest. Morale among the French defenders was at its lowest ebb. It was into this atmosphere of despair that Joan, now officially sanctioned by the Dauphin, arrived in April 1429. She brought not just troops, but a renewed sense of purpose, a burning belief in victory. She rode into the city, a banner depicting God, angels, and the fleur-de-lis held aloft, and her presence alone seemed to electrify the weary garrison and the terrified populace. She immediately took action, not as a military strategist in the traditional sense, but as an inspiring leader. She sent letters to the English commanders, demanding they lift the siege and return to England, threatening divine retribution if they refused. They scoffed, but the psychological impact on both sides was undeniable. For the French, it was a sign that God was with them. For the English, a strange, unsettling challenge. Joan's leadership was unconventional. She rallied the soldiers, not with complex battle plans, but with impassioned speeches, urging them to confession and prayer, to fight with faith and courage. She seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to inspire. On May 4th, 1429, just days after her arrival, the French launched an assault on the English outwork of St. Loup. Joan was there, leading the charge, seemingly fearless. The French captured the fort. The next day, she urged an attack on another English stronghold, Les Augustins. Despite initial setbacks, Joan's relentless drive pushed the French forward, and the fort fell. The English, who had seemed so unassailable, were now on the defensive, their siege lines being systematically dismantled. The turning point came on May 7th, with the assault on Les Tourelles, the formidable English fortress guarding the bridge into Orleans. Joan was wounded early in the battle, an arrow piercing her shoulder. For a moment, panic spread, but she quickly recovered, pulling the arrow out herself, and returned to the fray, her presence reinvigorating the French troops. Inspired by her courage, they fought with renewed ferocity, and by nightfall, Les Tourelles was taken. The English, demoralized and facing a resurgent French force, lifted the siege of Orleans on May 8, 1429, just 10 days after Joan's arrival. The relief of Orleans was a monumental victory, a psychological earthquake that shifted the entire balance of the war. It was the first major French victory in decades, and it instantly transformed Joan from a curious peasant girl into a national heroine, the Maid of Orleans. This triumph validated her divine mission in the eyes of many, and it ignited a wave of optimism that swept through France. The French now believed that God was on their side, and this belief translated into a newfound courage and determination on the battlefield. Following Orleans, Joan pressed for the next crucial step, the coronation of Charles VII at Reims. Reims Cathedral was the traditional site for French coronations, but it lay deep within English-held territory. It was a bold, almost reckless plan, but Joan understood its symbolic importance. A king crowned in Reims would solidify his legitimacy, not just in the eyes of his people, but in the eyes of God. Charles and his advisors were hesitant, fearing the risks of such a long march through enemy lands, but Joan's conviction, fueled by the recent success, ultimately prevailed. The Loire campaign began in June 1429. Under Joan's inspiration, the French army, now growing in size and confidence, launched a series of swift and decisive victories. They recaptured Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency, systematically clearing the English from the Loire Valley. The English commanders, accustomed to easy victories, were now facing a different kind of French army, one imbued with a fierce, almost fanatical spirit. The climax of this campaign came at the Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429. The French vanguard, led by La Hire and other seasoned captains, launched a surprise attack on the English army, which was still deploying. The English, caught off guard, were routed. Their famous longbowmen, usually so devastating, had no time to set up their defensive stakes. Many prominent English commanders, including John Talbot, were captured. It was a crushing defeat for the English, a mirror image of their earlier triumphs, and it cleared the path to Reims. The march to Reims was a triumphant procession. Town after town, previously loyal to the Burgundians or English, opened their gates to Charles and Joan without a fight. The psychological impact of Joan's presence was immense. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was formally crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral, with Joan of Arc standing proudly by his side. The ceremony, witnessed by thousands, was a profound moment of national renewal. It cemented Charles's claim to the throne and gave the French people a legitimate, divinely sanctioned king to rally behind. The coronation was not just a political event. It was a spiritual affirmation, a sign that the tide of war had truly turned. Yet, despite these miraculous victories, the war was far from over. Historians still debate whether Joan's influence began to wane after Reims, or if the court, now feeling more secure, became more cautious and less willing to follow her bold, divinely inspired strategies. Joan advocated for an immediate march on Paris, believing that capturing the capital would deal a final, decisive blow to the English. However, Charles and his advisors, perhaps content with their recent gains and wary of further risks, opted for negotiations and a more protracted approach. This decision proved costly. Joan did lead an assault on Paris in September 1429, but it was poorly supported by the royal army and ultimately failed. She was again wounded, this time in the leg, and the French forces were forced to retreat. This was her first major setback, and it marked a shift in her fortunes. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded her began to dim slightly, at least in the eyes of some at court. The political maneuvering and cautious strategies of the royal council increasingly clashed with Joan's direct, faith-driven approach. The following year, Joan continued to fight, leading smaller campaigns, but the grand, sweeping victories of 1429 seemed to elude her. In May 1430, while attempting to relieve the siege of Compiègne, she was captured by Burgundian forces, allies of the English. It was a devastating blow to French morale. The Burgundians, eager to gain favor with their English allies, sold her to the English for a substantial sum. The English were determined to discredit Joan, to prove that her visions were demonic, and that Charles VII's coronation was therefore illegitimate. They put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft in Rouen, a city under English control. The trial, which began in February 1431, was a political sham designed to condemn her. Presided over by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a staunch English partisan, the court was stacked against her. She was denied legal counsel, interrogated for months, and subjected to relentless questioning about her voices, her male attire, and her actions. Despite the immense pressure and the constant threat of torture, Joan defended herself with remarkable courage, intelligence, and unwavering faith. Her answers, often simple yet profound, frequently outwitted her accusers. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trick question designed to trap her, as no one can truly know, she famously replied, "If I am not, May God put me in it. If I am, may God keep me in it. Her steadfast refusal to deny her voices or recant her mission infuriated her judges. On May 24, 1431, after months of relentless interrogation and threats, Joan, exhausted and facing the prospect of being burned at the stake, signed a retraction, denying her visions and agreeing to wear women's clothes. However, within days, perhaps overwhelmed by guilt or renewed conviction, she recanted her retraction, choosing to reaffirm her divine mission and her male attire. This act sealed her fate. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc, barely 19 years old, was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine River to prevent any veneration of her remains. Her death, intended to break the spirit of the French, instead transformed her into a martyr. The English had hoped to erase her legacy, but they inadvertently enshrined it. Though Joan herself was gone, the flame she had lit in the hearts of the French people continued to burn. Her impact was profound and lasting. She had not only relieved Orleans and crowned a king, but she had instilled in the French a sense of national identity and purpose that transcended regional loyalties. She had shown them that victory was possible, that God was indeed on their side. The years following Joan's death saw a slow but steady shift in the war's momentum. Charles VII, now a legitimate king, began to consolidate his power and implement reforms. He reorganized the French army, creating a more professional, disciplined force. The French artillery in particular saw significant improvements, becoming a formidable weapon against English fortifications. Perhaps the most significant development was the gradual breakdown of the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, increasingly disillusioned with his English allies and perhaps swayed by a growing sense of French national identity, eventually reconciled with Charles VII. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 was a pivotal moment, ending the Burgundian Civil War and depriving the English of their most crucial ally. With Burgundy now on their side, the French began to systematically reclaim lost territories. Paris itself was liberated in 1436. The English, weakened by internal strife and facing a revitalized French army, found themselves increasingly on the defensive. The tide had turned irrevocably. The English, once the seemingly invincible invaders, were now fighting a losing battle to hold on to their dwindling possessions on the continent. The miracle of Joan of Arc had indeed set France on a path to revival, a path that would ultimately lead to the end of the 100 Years' War and the emergence of a unified French nation. The whispers of her courage, the echoes of her conviction, continued to inspire long after her physical presence had departed, weaving themselves into the very fabric of French identity. The long, weary years of conflict, stretching across generations, began to draw to a close with a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the tide. The English, once seemingly invincible, found their grip on French soil weakening, not through a single decisive blow, but through 1,000 small erosions of power and will. The once bright star of their dominion, kindled by the victories of Crécy and Agincourt, now flickered precariously. The French, under the renewed leadership of Charles VII, had learned from bitter experience. They had embraced a more cautious, strategic approach, avoiding open-field battles where English archers held sway, and focusing instead on siege warfare and the slow reclamation of their lands. The early 1450s saw a series of French successes that steadily pushed the English back. Normandy, the ancient ducal heartland that had been in English hands for decades, fell definitively to Charles VII's forces in 1450 after the Battle of Formigny. This engagement, though not as famous as the earlier English triumphs, marked a crucial turning point. The French, employing a combination of artillery and cavalry, managed to defeat an English army attempting to relieve a besieged town. It was a testament to the evolving nature of warfare and the French adaptation to new technologies. The English longbow, once the terror of Europe, found its dominance challenged by increasingly sophisticated firearms and the tactical deployment of combined arms. The loss of Normandy was a profound blow to English prestige and their hold on the continent. It signaled that the days of easy conquest were over, replaced by a tenacious, revitalized French resistance. The English presence in Gascony, their last significant foothold in southern France, became increasingly isolated. This region, loyal to the English crown for centuries due to economic ties and shared history, now found itself surrounded by a unified and determined French kingdom. In 1452, a flicker of hope ignited for the English when the Gascon nobility, feeling the pressure of French rule, appealed to King Henry VI for aid. John Talbot, the venerable Earl of Shrewsbury, a knight whose name had long been synonymous with English military prowess, was dispatched to Bordeaux with a small but dedicated force. His arrival was met with jubilation by the Gascons, who saw in him a savior, a symbol of the old order. Talbot, though well into his 70s, still possessed a fiery spirit and a reputation that preceded him. He quickly recaptured Bordeaux and several other towns, briefly rekindling the English dream of holding on to their ancient continental possessions. However, this brief resurgence was but a dying ember. The French, under Charles VII, were not to be deterred. They quickly mobilized a formidable army, equipped with the latest artillery, and marched south to confront Talbot. The stage was set for the final, decisive engagement of the 100 Years' War, a battle that would forever alter the map of Europe and solidify the nascent French nation. This final confrontation occurred on July 17, 1453, near the town of Castillon-la-Bataille, along the Dordogne River. The French army, commanded by Jean Bureau, an artillery master of considerable skill, had established a fortified camp. They had dug trenches, erected earthworks, and positioned their numerous cannons to create a formidable defensive position. This was not the open field where English archers had once reigned supreme. This was a carefully prepared killing ground, designed to negate the traditional English advantages. Talbot, ever impetuous and perhaps overconfident in his reputation and the loyalty of his Gascon allies, chose to launch a direct assault on the French camp. He had received intelligence that the French were retreating, and eager to capitalize on this perceived weakness, he pressed his attack without fully reconnoitering the enemy positions. This decision, though brave, proved to be a fatal miscalculation. As the English and Gascon forces advanced, they were met with a devastating barrage of French artillery fire. The cannons, firing iron balls and grapeshot, tore through the English ranks, causing horrific casualties and sowing chaos. The sheer volume and accuracy of the French bombardment were unprecedented. Men and horses fell in droves, their armor proving little protection against the destructive power of gunpowder. The roar of the cannons, the screams of the wounded, and the acrid smell of sulfur filled the air, turning the battlefield into a scene of utter devastation. Historians still debate the precise number of cannons the French employed at Castillon, but contemporary accounts suggest a truly formidable array, perhaps as many as 300 pieces of varying sizes. This massive deployment of artillery marked a significant shift in military strategy. demonstrating the weapon's undeniable power in siege and field warfare. It was a stark departure from the medieval battles dominated by cavalry charges and archer volleys. Amidst the carnage, Talbot's horse was struck by a cannonball, pinning him beneath it. His son, John Talbot, Viscount Lisle, fought valiantly to protect his father, but was also killed. The sight of their fallen commander and the relentless French bombardment broke the English and Gascon morale. What began as an orderly assault quickly devolved into a desperate rout. The French, seeing their advantage, launched a counterattack, completing the destruction of the English force. The Battle of Castillon was a decisive French victory, marking the end of the 100 Years' War. John Talbot, the last great English commander of the war, lay dead on the field, a poignant symbol of the end of an era. The English had lost their final significant army in France, and with it, their last hope of retaining their continental possessions. Following Castillon, Bordeaux, the last major English stronghold in Gascony, surrendered to Charles VII in October 1453. The English presence in France, which had once stretched from the Channel to the Pyrenees, was now reduced to a single, isolated outpost, Calais. This port city, strategically located on the narrowest part of the English Channel, remained in English hands for another century, serving as a bitter reminder of their lost empire. But its retention was a minor consolation compared to the vast territories that had been reclaimed by the French crown. The expulsion of the English from France, save for Calais, had profound consequences for both nations. For France, it marked the consolidation of royal power and the emergence of a truly unified nation-state. The war, though devastating, had forged a sense of national identity among the French people, transcending regional loyalties. Charles VII, once mockingly known as the King of Bourges, had redeemed himself and earned the title Charles the Victorious. He had successfully centralized the administration, reformed the army, and established a standing professional force, reducing the reliance on feudal levies. The French monarchy emerged from the war stronger and more authoritative than ever before, laying the groundwork for the absolute monarchy of later centuries. The Long War had also spurred significant social and economic changes in France. The devastation of the countryside led to a shift in agricultural practices and population movements. The emergence of a more centralized government fostered a sense of national purpose and allowed for greater investment in infrastructure and economic recovery. The French language, once challenged by English influence in certain regions, solidified its position as the national tongue. For England, the loss of its continental empire was a bitter pill to swallow. It plunged the country into a period of internal turmoil as the defeated nobility and disgruntled soldiers returned home. The psychological impact of losing territories held for centuries was immense. The immediate aftermath saw the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, both vying for the English throne. This internal strife, lasting for over 30 years, was in many ways a direct consequence of the 100 Years' War. The vast resources poured into the continental conflict, the disillusionment of the returning armies, and the weakened authority of the monarchy all contributed to the instability that plunged England into civil war. Yet, from this crucible of defeat and internal conflict, England too would eventually forge a stronger, more insular national identity. Forced to turn inward, English energies would eventually be directed towards maritime exploration and the establishment of a global empire rather than continental conquest. The English language, no longer vying for dominance with French on the continent, began its own distinct evolution. The 100 Years' War, spanning 116 years in total, from 1337 to 1453, was more than just a series of battles. It was a crucible that shaped the destinies of two great European nations. It transformed warfare, ushering in the age of gunpowder and professional armies. It solidified national identities, laying the foundations for modern France and England. It reshaped political landscapes, strengthening monarchies and centralizing power. As the echoes of the final cannon shots faded from Castillon, a new chapter in European history began to unfold. The medieval world, with its chivalric ideals and feudal structures, was slowly giving way to the early modern era. The long, weary conflict had left scars, but it had also sown the seeds of new growth, new ambitions, and new ways of understanding the world. The fields of France, once stained with blood and tears, would slowly heal, and the whispers of the past would mingle with the burgeoning hopes of a future unburdened by the ancient claims of distant kings. The age of the great continental wars for dynastic succession was drawing to a close, replaced by the rising tide of national interests and the relentless march of technological innovation. And perhaps, as the stars twinkled over the quiet fields, they bore witness not just to the end of a war, but to the slow, deliberate birth of nations. The dust settled, not with a sudden crash, but with a slow, almost imperceptible drift across the landscapes of France and England. The 100 Years' War, in its sprawling, fragmented reality, had finally concluded, leaving behind a world irrevocably altered. The most profound transformation, perhaps, was the very concept of identity. Before the long conflict, loyalties often lay with the local lord, the ducal house, or the immediate community. A peasant in Aquitaine might have felt more kinship with a Gascon noble than with a distant Parisian king. But the relentless ebb and flow of armies, the shared suffering, and the growing sense of a common enemy began to forge something new, a nascent national consciousness. In France, the English occupation, particularly the long decades of their presence in the north, inadvertently solidified a sense of Frenchness. Joan of Arc, in her brief, blazing, comet-like passage across the stage of history, embodied this awakening. Her call to drive out the English was not merely a feudal obligation, but a spiritual and patriotic imperative. The victory at Castillon in 1453, though perhaps less dramatic than Agincourt, marked the true end of English territorial ambitions in France, leaving them with only Calais. This final expulsion was a powerful unifying force, allowing the French monarchy to consolidate its power and begin the long process of centralizing the state. The fragmented mosaic of feudal lordships slowly began to coalesce into a more cohesive kingdom, with the king in Paris increasingly seen as the embodiment of France itself. Across the Channel, England too underwent a profound shift. The loss of vast continental territories, once seen as a birthright and a source of immense wealth, forced the English to look inward. Their identity, once intertwined with their Norman heritage and continental possessions, began to root itself more firmly in the island nation. The English language, which had been slowly gaining ground against Norman French in the centuries prior, now truly flourished as a language of government, law, and literature. Chaucer had already laid much of the groundwork, but the war's end accelerated this linguistic consolidation. Parliament, which had gained significant influence during the war due to the Crown's constant need for funds, continued to assert its authority, laying foundational stones for a distinct English political system. The English became more definitively The English, turning their gaze towards maritime ventures and a future shaped by the sea rather than continental dominion. The military landscape was equally transformed. The longbow, which had dominated battlefields for over a century, proved the devastating effectiveness of missile weaponry against heavily armored knights. This was not merely a tactical innovation, it was a social one. The yeoman archer, a commoner, could fell a nobleman, challenging the very hierarchy of medieval warfare. While cavalry remained important, its role began to shift from the primary shock force to a more supportive one, used for flanking maneuvers or pursuing a broken enemy. The true revolution, however, lay in gunpowder. Early cannons, like the ones used at Castillon, were primitive and prone to bursting, but their potential was undeniable. They could breach castle walls that had once been impregnable, rendering obsolete the very fortresses that had defined medieval power. This technological leap signaled the slow but inevitable decline of the knightly class and the rise of professional, disciplined infantry armed with new, more destructive weapons. The war also accelerated the decline of feudalism, a system already showing cracks. The constant need for large, standing armies rather than temporary levies of vassals forced monarchs to seek new sources of revenue. Taxation became more widespread and systematic, centralizing financial power in the crown. Mercenary companies, though often a scourge on the land, became increasingly common, as they offered a professional fighting force loyal to coin rather than feudal oath. This shift from obligation to payment further eroded the bonds of feudal society. Land, once the sole measure of wealth and power, began to be supplemented by commerce and trade, particularly as port cities like Bordeaux and Calais thrived, even amidst the conflict. The economic disruption caused by the war, while devastating in many regions, also spurred innovation and new forms of financial organization, laying groundwork for early capitalist ventures. Historians still debate the precise extent to which the 100 Years' War was a direct cause of these transformations versus merely an accelerator of existing trends. Some argue that the seeds of national identity, military evolution, and feudal decline were already sown by the Black Death and other forces, and the war simply provided the harsh crucible in which these changes were forged more quickly and decisively. Others contend that the sheer duration and intensity of the conflict created unique pressures that fundamentally reshaped European society in ways that would not have occurred otherwise. For instance, the very concept of a standing army, rather than a feudal levy, was forced upon monarchs by the continuous nature of the conflict, leading to the development of more centralized administrative structures to support them. One lesser-known consequence was the profound impact on cartography and navigation. The constant movement of armies, the need to provision them, and the strategic importance of understanding terrain led to more detailed maps and a greater understanding of geography. While not a direct scientific revolution, the practical demands of war subtly pushed forward the art of mapping, which would later prove invaluable for exploration. Furthermore, the war indirectly contributed to the growth of diplomatic practices. The long periods of truce and negotiation, often involving complex agreements and exchanges of hostages, fostered the development of more sophisticated international relations, moving beyond simple declarations of war and peace. Envoys and ambassadors became increasingly important figures, laying the groundwork for modern diplomacy. The psychological scars of the war ran deep. Generations had known nothing but conflict, raids, and uncertainty. The memory of chevauchés, the burning of towns, and the constant fear of foreign soldiers shaped the collective consciousness of both nations. In France, particularly, the devastation of the countryside was immense, leaving behind ruined villages and fallow fields. Yet out of this destruction, a resilience emerged. The necessity of rebuilding fostered ingenuity and communal effort. The long struggle also instilled a certain pragmatism. The grand chivalric ideals, while not entirely extinguished, were tempered by the harsh realities of gunpowder and masked archers. The age of the individual knight, seeking personal glory, began to yield to the age of disciplined armies fighting for national interests. The war's end did not usher in an era of immediate peace and prosperity for England. The return of disgruntled, unemployed soldiers, combined with the loss of French territories, fueled internal tensions that would erupt into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that lasted for decades. This internal strife further solidified the shift from continental ambition to domestic consolidation, forcing the English monarchy to focus on securing its own island realm before looking outward again. For France, the end of the English threat allowed the monarchy to turn its attention to consolidating power over powerful regional dukes like those of Burgundy and Brittany, leading to further centralization and the eventual formation of a truly unified kingdom under the Valois kings. The final curtain fell not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet, almost mundane, signing of a treaty that Elie acknowledged a reality already established on the battlefield. The 100 Years' War, a sprawling, complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and innovation, had fundamentally reshaped the political, social, and military landscape of Western Europe. It had given birth to nations, transformed warfare, and accelerated the decline of an old order, leaving behind the fertile ground from which the modern world would eventually begin to grow. The echoes of its battles, the whispers of its heroes, and the silent, enduring changes it wrought continued to resonate through the centuries, long after the last arrow had flown and the last cannon had fired.